thank you all for coming. Those of you who were interested in this topic, it's one that we have worked through and trying to make it as facile as we can, within the limits of working with Prism, our electronic database. I am chair of the IRB for Carilion Clinic, and I think it's important that you recognize that we operate in a situation where we have multiple separate legal entities. Virginia Tech, an element of which is the School of Medicine, part of Virginia Tech. We have Radford University with whom we collaborate, etc. So there are multiple institutions. John, why don't you give me the next slide? And I think I can use that. I'm going to ask up front if any of you has a question while I'm discussing this. Please either raise your hand virtually or put something in the chat. I'd rather deal with the questions as I go through this rather than have to field them at the end, frankly. To just quickly review the HRPO office, an element of Carilion Clinic, again, a separate entity, three distinct components. You see them listed there. The IRB, we have an IRB A and B, so there are two different IRBs. One that meets on the second Wednesday at 7 a.m. and another that meets on the fourth Thursday at 11:30 a.m. Another element of the HRPO is education and outreach. Hillary Hedrick is our new education manager, and we're really delighted to have her with us. We do quality assurance and improvement activities through Hillary and all members of the HRPO office, frankly. So they're the three elements of HRPO. And Carilion has the oversight authority for research involving our patients, the Carilion faculty, who are effectively employees, and for the facilities involved with Carilion. And that involves each of the healthcare facilities, both the elements in Roanoke, elements in Radford, as an example. Our role is to protect the rights and welfare of our patients, and that really is critical. And we have to be very sensitive about the fact that the population base that we serve isn't fully, they're not a place that is familiar with research, ongoing research necessarily. They're just becoming familiar with that. We also have to deal, and you hear us talk about this, we have to, on an ongoing basis, apply federal, state, and institutional requirements. We have to adhere to that. We have no choice, or else we end up getting ourselves in trouble, and in turn, the whole organization. John, the next slide, please. Carilion then has what we call memoranda of understanding with Virginia Tech and with other entities like Radford. The MOU includes IRB reliance and IRB review responsibilities. And quite frankly, if it involves Carilion patients, in most cases, the IRB of record is going to be the Carilion IRB. And we have these formalized agreements, the third bullet there, for exempt and for non-exempt human subjects research. The most important thing, if I'm going to drive a message home while we're discussing this today, is communication, communication, communication. We see problems develop recurringly when communication is lacking between the principal investigator, who is ultimately responsible for everything that occurs as part of a research study. And that PI at present time is going to be based at Carilion because it involves Carilion patients. Communications between that PI and all collaborators, some of whom may be at Tech, at the medical school, etc. And the PI is responsible for assuring that those communications occur. Next slide, please, John. Thank you. When Korean Clinic, when our IRB serves as the IRB of record, um, the Korean physicians or whoever it is who's doing the research and is serving as the PI at Carilion will proceed with the submission process through our electronic base PRISM. It is so vitally important, and I'll show you examples of that in some screenshots, to include information about external collaborators in terms of what their role is going to be as part of the research project. And that will be defined in the research app on PRISM. At the present time, the rules are that you've got to be a full-time Carilion physician or employee if you're going to be designated as a PI or a co-PI with someone at TEP. And that person will be responsible for entering the information. Next slide, John. So what I'd like to do is take a closer look at the app, trying to familiarize you a little bit with what it looks like and to help with this. The front end of the app contains information that you provide concerning collaborators, study, the principal study coordinator, etc. Let's go through these screenshots then that follow, please, and I'll give you a feel for what comes up. As I mentioned already, PRISM is our submission system. It's an online system with which we, or let's just say, we know that there are shortcomings with PRISM. We're aware of them. We would like to circumvent them, but a lot of times this software can be fluxed, twisted, but not really changed a whole lot. To access the PRISM system, as the second bullet shows, you have to be have an active user name and password. To access it, that means you've got to be an employee of Carilion and come under the aegis of Carilion Clinic and the IRB. You don't have a active Carilion Clinic directory username and password. The Carilion PI is responsible and team members who are employees for completing the application in PRISM. Go ahead, please, John. Thank you. One of the screens that you'll see is depicted in this screenshot. You see that questions are always numbered in PRISM, and you can see that item 9.1 says, is this a collaboration between Carilion Clinic and another institution? And in many cases today, we are seeing that. So the answer is affirmative, yes. And 9.2, then you define whom that individual is, providing contact information. They're working with the lead PI, so they're a co-PI. Go to the next slide, please, John. If it is a multi-center study and the Carilion IRB is acting as one site of the multi-center, then the answer to this question on 9.3 is yes. And it is important to state, and deviations from this really cause problems. The protocol we followed as written, if there's going to be a deviation from that protocol or a potential change, then a change update has to be submitted through PRISM. Very important. But a protocol can be modified midstream virtually at any time up until the time the study is closed. Is the Carilion acting as the coordinating center for the multi-center study? Yes. And I can tell you, if it's a multi-center study that involves other sites, that is a very labor-intensive process, but we can do that. Next slide, John. No, John, I'll ask this. Any questions? If you see any hands or chat questions? Nothing. Hearing nothing, I'll presume nothing. Is Carilion acting as, this is the answer to the question if Carilion is not a multi-center. If it's not a multi-center study, the investigators and all collaborators would be under the jurisdiction of not under another IRB, then they should be listed, or if they are, when they are listed as collaborators at another site. But Carilion is the IRB of record. They have to be listed as depicted under 9.7 here. If they're under another IRB, they have to list which IRB. You have to list their names, and specifically, most importantly, is what their study responsibilities are. We recently had obviously a PI at another site who was going to co-PI, I should say, at another site who was obviously going to have to be consenting patients, and yet that wasn't demarcated or checked, and we had to go back and say, please revise this because it's obvious that you want this person to be able to do consenting. So when they're under the jurisdiction of another IRB, but it's not a multi-center study, it will be Virginia Tech, it could be Radford, whatever. Go to the next slide, please. When Carilion IRB is serving as the IRB of record, their collaborating roles are very important in their sites. Are you requesting, and this question comes up under item 9 again, requesting Carilion Clinic IRB serve the IRB of record for other participating institutions? The answer is yes, and that happens commonly. Usually I might add after communication. I'm again stressing that word. Barbara knows this. She and either I or Meredith are talking to her whenever this is occurring, and we're already working this out ahead of time. But it's so important that that kind of thing occur. But again, when Carilion is serving as the IRB of record and for other participating institutions, institutions have to be identified as noted here. The name of the investigator or coordinator or whoever it is, and their responsibilities all have to be clearly defined. Very, very important. Next slide, please. If there is no external funding, then the not applicable checkbox is the best one to check, and just saying you don't have external funding. The most important thing then is if there is no external funding, how and secondarily then how is training occurring? It is so important that the research team be trained both at the collaborating institution and obviously locally. PI is responsible locally, and the co-investigators must work directly with the team at both institutions to make this communication effective. And it can be, as you can see highlighted here, through face-to-face or virtual communications, phone calls, emails, but much of that should be encrypted and secure email, especially if there are any patient information. John, I think we can go to the next slide. Again, the word communication comes up. What are the communication plans? These are part of the questions that are going to come up. What are your plans for assuring ongoing communication? The collaborating co-investigators or co-PIs should be communicating with the research team all the time. And when there are needed proposed changes, that form should be submitted. It's a change update form, not a big deal. And any associated documents that need to be changed need to be identified, revised, and submitted. For example, if there's a change in what one recognizes as a side effect of medication, we had this happen recently, or side effect of a procedure, that needs to be updated in the consent form when that recognition occurs. We had an unfortunate event occur, side effect of patient affecting a patient, and it had been not previously recognized. Unfortunately, in that circumstance, It gets reported to OHRP and the FDA in the case of advice. But when we're updating information, as we learned during the studies while being conducted, that side effect or ill effect has to be included in the revised consent form. And it usually requires an IRB app change as well, because there's a list in the application further down of all side effects. Again, communication. Educating the staff when something like this happens to be alert to the possibility of a previously unidentified problem. Can't stress the communication issue enough. And it's perhaps easier within Carilion. If it were just a Carilion site, it becomes a little more complicated when it's not. And we've seen faux pas just result because of communication issues. Next slide, please, John. And as part of this, if Carilion is the IRB of record, but some of the research events are occurring outside of Carilion, PI has to document how he or she is going to provide continual oversight. Again, communication issues coming up. And data safety monitoring during this process is so important. And a defined data safety monitoring plan will be lower down in the IRB app process in PRISM will be defined, and ensuring that the integrity of the study is maintained. All this stuff is important in terms of communication. There's to make sure the protocol is followed, changes occur when it's necessary, etc. Next slide, please. Yes, was there a question?
Yes. Is there a threshold for which you would say any changes require notification? So if it's something very basic, it doesn't require communication through the IRB, or is it just better safe than sorry and go with any changes to the protocol?
Let's say this. I'll introduce the names of folks who are listening in as the group, but if one has a question as to whether something should or should not be reported, it's always better to rely upon the reporting, and we can say, don't worry about that. But you can make a phone call to Eric Wines or Brooke Blevins, and they will give you an insight. Or you could call me if you'd like. But quite frankly, better to err on the side of over-reporting than under-reporting, obviously.
Absolutely.
Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Good. So next, I think we go to the next slide. Oh, no, we had moved up. This is important. If identifiable data or specimens are transferred outside of Carilion, as is in this slide, this is item 914. It's all in that section when there's collaboration, and it is transferred. The PHI has to be protected in some way. Usually the information is shared through RedCap today with the outside individual. We like to have data transfer only occur a hard copy or electronically where it's coded so that the individual cannot readily be identified. The issue that comes up is that Carilion Clinic is a HIPAA compliant organization, and Virginia Tech is not a HIPAA compliant organization. That's not making any negative comment about Tech. It's just that they haven't had the need at this point to get HIPAA compliance. But because of that, we have to be very careful about sharing data that would allow potentially identifying a patient in retrospect by an outside entity. So the key thing here is we'd like to use de-identified information, and the identifiers that would allow connection with the patient would remain under lock and key, quote unquote, in a secure database with the Carilion Clinic PI. So that's just very, very important concept to get across. Any questions about that? If not, John, maybe I can move on to the next slide.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat yet. Remember, folks, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat or just unmute yourself and put your video on or not and ask. Thanks.
And these are just a few reminders about collaborator commitments. When we have the agreement with Tech that we're the IRB of record, that the VT collaborators will adhere to the VT IRB, their IRB requirements. And this includes necessary training as pointed by the bullets here, pointed out by the bullets, and disclosing any potential conflicts of interest. We recently had to spend a lot of time dealing with conflicts of interest to make sure they were handled well prior to the initiation of the study. Sometimes it gets frustrating, but it is important to do this. And we're working our way through certain elements of this at this time as research expands. So it's a birthing pains, if you will. Both our IRB and Virginia Tech's IRB verify to each other the compliance with their own requirements for approval of a study investigator. Collaborators' responsibilities is, again, the word keeps coming up, maintain communication with the PI and all the staff. And all of this communication is outlined as I've defined it in these screenshots in the IRB app. And it's so important to follow the study procedures. We recently had an occurrence where a minor deviation from the study entry requirements was applied for a good reason, I might add, but it had not been defined in the IRB app. So we had to ask, when we discovered this through communication again, we had to ask for a change update in order to just document what was being done and was not inappropriate in any way, but needed to be included and written down. And the MOU necessitates adherence on both sides of the fence, and that's not been a problem. We find the collaboration very beneficial and fruitful, and we all feel strongly about the importance of carrying that forward. I think I have one or two more slides very quickly, John. You see my mugshot here. Glenn Edwards is the vice chair for Committee A, which meets on this second Wednesday of the month, and Ellis Pagan is the vice chair for Committee B with me, that meets on the fourth Thursday of the month. And the other IRB HRPO office team is on the next slide, please. And you see Meredith Talmadge, who couldn't be with us today. Meredith is the director of the HRPO. And Eric Wines, with whom I speak often. Eric tends to handle a lot of facilitating submissions by PIs that are going to go full board. Brooke Blevins handled the second individual on the slide from the left. Brooke tends to handle a lot of expedited and accelerated studies. Picture of Hillary Hedrick, our new education manager, and Tanner Harmon is the sort of an operations administrator who's handles things behind the scenes and helps us out immensely. If there are no other questions, I think I should turn this mic over to Barbara DeCoste.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schlupner. I just wanted to mention that this team is really outstanding with their responsiveness. In particular, we've worked a lot with Brooke Blevins, and anytime we just have a little question, like, does this require us to update our IRB or something along those lines, or anything? Does this require an IRB in the first place? She has just been so responsive and gives a thorough and very helpful explanation for why or why not. So thank you all for that.
All right. So my part of the presentation is going to kind of do the reverse and talk about when Virginia Tech is the IRB of record. Let's see. So we're going to talk about the requirements for Virginia Tech researchers, just a brief overview of the Reliance process and the process for accessing Carilion clinic patients and data. So our researchers have to complete human subjects training, and we use CITI, but we require different modules than Carilion does. And so if you're a Virginia Tech researcher, even if you're going to be collaborating on research with Carilion, you're going to need to complete our basic biomedical or social behavioral course. If you're going to be doing clinical research or research that's funded by the NIH, you're going to need to complete good clinical practice modules in CITI. You're going to need to have your CV on file. We like for those to be updated every 3 years. So you're going to upload that into our system, protocol management. You're going to have to complete a conflict of interest disclosure that's required for each project. And then researchers who have dual roles, some of you may work at Carilion and Tech. And so we ask that you designate a role. So are you doing this research with your Tech hat, or are you doing it with your Carilion hat? You have to pick a hat before you decide to go down the path of pursuing your research. And then you can contact our office to verify the training requirements if you do have that dual role, because we do have some exceptions we can make for researchers who fall into that category.
So if I might interrupt just really quickly. So is it true that there are some CITI modules and some of the modules are the same? So you wouldn't have to repeat them, but there are just additional ones either.
That's exactly correct. So when you go into CITI and you affiliate with Tech or Carilion, it'll tell you what modules that you need to complete. So you may not necessarily need to complete all of the modules for the basic biomedical if you've already completed some through Carilion.
Okay.
And several years ago, we worked really closely with Carilion to align our modules as closely as possible as we could. And so there's still a few modules that are outliers for Virginia Tech and Carilion as well. And so you don't have to necessarily complete all the modules. It's just the ones that have not been completed yet.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. And so if the research is being initiated here at Virginia Tech, the submission should include Carilion Clinic as a collaborating institution. So you need to list Carilion as a collaborator and include the individuals who you're going to be working with and their contact information and their role in the project. So are they going to be interviewing participants? Are they going to be analyzing data? So you need to describe their role. So when we receive that submission, and that's submitted through protocol management, when we receive that submission, we contact Carilion Clinic to start the Reliance process. And so we reach out to them, give them a copy of the protocol, explain the roles of each individual researcher. Now, while that's happening, the Carilion Clinic researchers should follow their process within the HRPO, because that is a separate process and it does need to be documented. So you would need to reach out to HRPO while we're working with Carilion to establish that Reliance agreement. Those processes can take place in parallel, so you don't necessarily have to wait for our review to be completed and that Reliance agreement to be established. It's best to get everything started as soon as possible because these agreements do take time. And before anyone gets started, the review arrangements have to be documented. So the Reliance agreements, the MOU, those things need to be documented and agreed upon before the research can get started at the participating sites. So once the Reliance agreement has been established, our office will issue an approval memo when the Virginia Tech IRB has approved it. Carilion will will issue a memo authorizing the reliance agreement, and then the research can begin. Research plans that include accessing Carilion clinic patients or data. A Carilion clinic researcher has to be a collaborator, and you need to contact our office before starting the submission process, because we need to determine who's going to be the IRB of record. So Dr. Schleppner said, usually when it's Carilion patients or data, Carilion is the IRB of record. And so we need to make sure we've established who's going to be reviewing before you start the submission process. And a reliance agreement is still going to be needed regardless. So before you start down this path, there is a process that we've outlined to help researchers who want to do research with patients or data from Carilion Clinic. And so it seems a little odd that you would contact PRDP, which is our Privacy and Research Data Protection Program, before you contact our office, but they are the ones that have established a relationship with Carilion, a coordinator there to help walk you through the process, what you need to make sure that the data that you're getting really aligns with the mission. And so you need to make sure your research aligns with their mission, which is to improve the health of the communities we serve. And so the next thing you'll need to do is connect with a Carilion Clinic collaborator. Sometimes researchers will reach out to us and they say, well, I want to get data from Carilion, but they don't have a collaborator yet. And so PRDP will be able to help you identify a sponsor that can help you with your research. So that individual will be someone from Carilion, a Carilion researcher that will help you with your research. And then next, you need to determine the minimum amount of data you need to answer your research question. And so think about what you're trying to do, what data you need. We don't want you collecting additional data if you don't need it, especially if you're going to just be accessing existing data. You should only be getting or requesting the data that you need, the minimum amount possible. And then finally, PRDP and Carilion Clinic's Health Analytic Research Team are going to coordinate to guide researchers through the remainder of the process. And so these are the individuals that are going to be kind of holding your hands through this process to help you make sure you get all the reviews in place and all the appropriate documentation. So the process of working with Carilion on the PRDP front is still fairly new. And so if you've gone through this process and you have feedback, our director would like to hear any feedback that you have to provide about it so we can make improvements where needed. And so that concludes the end of my presentation. Does anyone have questions for me? I guess Dr. Schleppner as well. We can both take questions at this point.
Absolutely. What kind of questions do you all have for these wonderful resources that we have with us today?
And I'd like, may I say something, Sherry, please? I just like to echo the sentiments that Barbara expressed. It's so important. If you've got a problem, call us. We don't want you frustrated, nor ourselves frustrated with trying to get things done when we just hear about things after the fact. And when you run into a problem, call me, Meredith, Eric, Brooke, and we'll try to steer you in the right direction to facilitate things. We want to get research performed. We're anxious. I'm a researcher myself, or former active researcher, and I want to see it happen, but we got to do it. It's very different today than it was even 10 years ago, much less 15 or 20 years ago. And so communication at all stages is so important to make it move quickly. We'd like it to. Sometimes things get bogged down. As I said, we are going through a birthing process, and the things are evolving quickly. we'd like them to evolve more quickly, but there's some impediments to that we try to facilitate. Okay.
I assume the sooner you identify an issue, the better to reach out to somebody. So they're helping you proactively as opposed to helping you try to fix something, which may not always be fixable. And I do agree. Sometimes it may feel like a bear, but our IRB offices are definitely intended to be constructive rather than obstructive. Other thoughts? What kind of questions do y'all have for folks? Just concerns or struggles or anything?
Hey, Dr. Schlupner and Dr. Shikazi, this is Sarah, parent. I have a question for you. I had someone ask me this the other day, and I think your slides make it clear, but I just want to clarify for myself. If you submit a manuscript based on research that you've conducted in partnership with collaborators at Virginia Tech, if you're a Carilion individual, work for Carilion primarily, and they come to you and say, we only see the Carilion IRB approved this study. Would we then reference the MOU in response to reviewers as part of the process to let them know, oh, this was a collaboration between both Virginia Tech researchers and Carilion clinic researchers? Would that suffice to reference that MOU, I guess is what I'm asking.
You're talking about in a publication, Sarah?
Yes, sir.
Barbara, I think that makes perfect sense. You not agree?
Yeah, and I think the approval memos that are issued will reference the study number. And so in some cases, it will have all the collaborators, not all cases, but it will show that that's particular study that the publication is referencing has been approved by an IRB. So usually that's sufficient.
And that will
Okay.
suffice for most reviewers.
Mhm.
They don't usually dig into that deeply, other than having the public lead author affirm that.
Okay. Thank you. I really appreciate that. I wasn't sure when they asked, so I'm glad we had this session today and I got the opportunity to ask so I can clarify for them. So thank you both.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Dr. Schlupner. Thank you, Barbara, for being here and sharing this information and answering these questions. And as I mentioned, they are wonderful to reach out to and just answer any follow-up questions that you may have beyond this time we have together here. So if there's nothing further, enjoy your day and the rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thank
Very
you
good,
all.
Barbara. Take care.
Thank you so
You
much.
too. Thank you.